So, welcome to here, the Antique Bar, and thank you to the Antique Bar for inviting us. And welcome to those people who have joined on Zoom. Hopefully I know some of them. So, here we are, myself, Tracy Watson and JJ Adams. Next slide, please. So, So I'm the chair of the WAF Association. It does say the WAAF, I'll not wave my hand across the screen, the WAAF, the WRAF and the RAFW Association, but we tend to refer to that as just the WAF Association because it's just easier than that great long title there. Next slide, please. So what are we going to do today? So I will talk a little bit about who I am, why we're here today, a précis of my career. Now those people who know me know that I can ramble a little, so I will try and keep it brief. I will introduce you to the WAF Association and tell you how I got involved, and then I will introduce and pass you over to JJ, who will talk about the bulk of what we're talking about today. And if there are any questions, could you please leave them till the end and we'll cover those then. Next slide, please. So who am I? I was born to army parents in Singapore. I was only there 18 months or so, so I don't really recall any of it. I then spent my childhood living in Belgium, Germany and the UK. So a lot of travelling. You probably won't hear any particular accent in me, but if I know somebody who's from Yorkshire, for example, then I will pick up a little bit of Yorkshire. Anybody in Wiltshire, then I will pick up a little bit of that, Welsh and so on. I went to boarding school until I did my O-levels. That's GCSEs for you younger people. And then from there I went on to do A-levels at the local comprehensive, which is where I may have picked up a tiny bit of a Yorkshire accent. So, and then I joined the Women's Royal Air Force in 1989. Next slide, please. So why are we here today? So we're predominantly here to talk about the roles of women in the Royal Air Force, or the Women's Royal Air Force, and how that has changed over the years from when both myself and JJ joined, and then how that has moved on since then. And we'll use our own experiences to explain that. And we'll introduce you very, very briefly to the WAF Association, or I will introduce you to the WAF Association, who we are and what we do. Next slide, please. So I joined the Air Force, the Women's Royal Air Force as it was then, in February 1989 at RAF Swindeby in Lincolnshire. And those first two photos on this side was me in training and my pass-out photo. And the one on the far left-hand side was me hard at work, clearly, in the telephone exchange at RAF Church Fenton, which was my first unit. Next slide, please. And so where was I posted? I have worked the length and breadth of the UK, as far south as Plymouth, as far north as RAF Buchan, which for those who don't know is an hour north of Aberdeen. And my stations included HQ Strike Command, or Air Command as it is now called. I worked at both times there. HQ Personnel and Training Command, which was at RAF Innsworth. HMS Collingwood, which sounds a little bizarre for someone in the Royal Air Force. However, it was a tri-service unit and I was one of the instructors there. I also worked as a recruiter in the Armed Forces Recruiting Office down in Plymouth, and I've had a couple of overseas tours in Cyprus and in Belgium. In amongst those 30 years, I had two operational tours, one in Turkey for Air Ops Iraq and one in Afghanistan in 2009. Next slide, please. So this is a couple of photos from my deployment to Afghanistan. On the left, on the right here, me with my satellite dish. That was the satellite dish that I was in charge of, which for all of those, again, that know me, know I'm not really a technical person, but I was in charge of this and had to maintain it and keep it going. And this particular photo was because I had to go to on the roof every 15 minutes to sweep the snow off. Otherwise we would lose communications. So that's about as technical as my work got, but I was happy to take it. And then on the right hand side there, my ID card, which you'll notice has a tiny bit cut out of it. That's because when you leave, they cut that piece out so that you can tell that it's no longer valid. Next slide, please. This photo here is of three of us, three friends out in Afghanistan, myself on the far left-hand side, a friend in the middle who was British Army, and on this end, US Air Force. So girls stuck together. We got on with the boys, that was fine, but us girls stuck together, and we were a bit like the Three Amigos, really, let's be fair. Thank you, next slide. I also got involved in various parades and special events. This one here, nearest to me, you can just about make me out there, was a Remembrance Day parade, November the 11th, 2005, under the Menin Gate in Ypres, which I can only say is a moment that I will never forget it. I was lucky enough to do a second parade in 2007, but that one there, you might be able to see the tvlocale.be at the top there, is a screenshot from the video that's on YouTube, and I spotted myself. Over on the far side there was a closure ceremony for one of the units that I was based at, and unfortunately various RAF units have closed over the years, and that was one of them. As you can see, I'm the tiny one in the middle, and the two boys either side was my section, so I was in charge of those two boys. Next slide, please. The photo nearest to me, more parades and special events, so the photo nearest to me was the Afghanistan parade in 2015, which went through London and went past St Paul's Cathedral, finishing up at the Guildhall. I have never been in pain like it. Never been in pain like it. But I was desperate not to fall out, because you just don't fall out of a parade. So just kept going, keep going Tracy, keep going. And thankfully I did get to the end, but it was a really, really proud moment. On the far side there is myself and one of my very best friends. After the Battle of Britain service in 2015 at St Paul's Cathedral. And what you can just about see is a Spitfire there at the front. Next slide, please. More parades and special events, and this one, as you can see from the tartan, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later, this was after the 2019 Cenotaph Parade going through London. Extremely proud moment for all of us involved, and this was the ladies that were involved in our squad, if you like, in our flight, and wonderful women, wonderful women. Next slide, please. Again, more tartan, more looking like I'm dressed today. This is after the Battle of Britain service in 2019, I believe, and this was at Westminster Abbey. So we still all get involved in lots and lots of things. Next slide, please. You may or may not recognise that man that's next to me there. That is Gordon Banks of England football fame. I confess I didn't really know who he was, but I made a point of having my photo taken because I knew it would make lots of people very, very jealous. And I was sat next to him at a formal dinner at HMS Collingwood. On the far side over there is Armed Forces Day down in Plymouth. I was invited from Fareham in Portsmouth, just outside Portsmouth, down to Plymouth, because the Navy chap that you can just about make out there was a friend of mine, and they didn't have any RAF, Plymouth being a Navy town, so he said, Trace, why don't you come down? So I did, and we helped open, that was a speedway thing called Armed Forces Day. Next slide, please. So, leaving the RAF, I left the RAF in 2019 from RAF Odeon, which you may or may not be aware is the home of the Chinook, the home of the Chinook force, hence the picture, the Chinook in the background there. And the photo on the far side was my very, very last day in uniform, and we'd had an air show recently, so that aircraft was still there. So, I left the Air Force. I had my retirement dinner, believe it or not, on HMS Victory. So, living in Portsmouth as I did at the time, I had the opportunity, I say opportunity, I asked the question, can I have my retirement dinner on the ship? And they said, all right then. So I did. I organised it myself, which I suppose is, you know, a bit egotistical, but I knew what I was going to get then. So that's what I did, and I had my retirement dinner on that glorious ship. Next Next slide, please. And this is one. Well, the next few pictures are a couple of pictures from that night. You can see there that it is a formal dinner, and the chap next to me is the one who hosted the event, and the lady this side of me is a friend who I'm going to see very, very soon actually. Is a Canadian lady who I met when I was serving out in Belgium, and she came over from Canada for this event. So yes, very lucky. Next slide, please. I was trying to take a photo, and if you go to the next one, that's what it really looked like. Somebody else took that photo because unfortunately the one that was being taken, there was too many photos and it didn't save. Hey ho, never mind, the world won't end. Next slide, please. So the WAF Association, who are we? We are a social association. We do no fundraising at all. And if you are a woman who has served in the Royal Air Force at any point in its existence, so whether that is WAAF, so Women's Auxiliary Air Force, those who served in the Second World War, the WRAF, so those ladies who served from 1949 through to 1994, or any woman who has served since then, since we joined the RAF proper, shall we say, since we were amalgamated into the RAF completely. So any of those women can join our association. It was formed in the late 1980s by ex-WAFs, ex-WAAF, because they wanted to make sure that they had that camaraderie that they had previously. As I said, there's no fundraising, we're not a charity, we are simply a friendship association. And the committee that we have, there's 5 of us, the committee will signpost members to any appropriate organisation for any help, assistance. So for example, the RAF Association, the RAF Benevolent Fund, RBL, Veterans Gateway, anything that into the right place so that they can get the appropriate help if required. But beyond that, what we're here for is friendship with like-minded ladies. Next slide, please. So how did I get involved? 2011, with the possibility of being medically discharged, I wanted to keep that WRAF connection. Now, as it turns out, I didn't get medically discharged. I didn't leave until 2019, but I didn't know that then. So I started to make some inquiries and found the WAF Association, the WAAF Association, and asked, is there a WRAF Association? Turns out, no, there wasn't, but that we as WRAF could join. So I joined.
Sorry.
Would you like some more of those biscuits?
Great.
Better than him throwing them on the floor, isn't it? And so I joined in 2012, and then by 2015 I was invited to join the committee as a publicity member, and then in 2018 I was invited to stand as chair. I was then voted in, and then this year I have been re-voted in. So this, for want of a better phrase, is my second term of office. Next slide, please. So what do we get involved in? There is an AGM, an annual general meeting, once a year. Annual gives that bit away. When we have a reunion, that's all at the same time. It always occurs in April, so we have just had that. We get involved in the RBL Remembrance Sunday Parade at the Cenotaph, I mentioned that earlier. Local Remembrance Day services, Battle of Britain Memorial Service, which often is at Westminster Abbey. However, in 2015, it was the 75th anniversary, so it was at St Paul's Cathedral. Various Armed Forces Day events and a multitude of other events throughout the year around the country. Things like this, for example. Next slide, please. So the next few slides are literally photos of what we do. So that there was the group photo after the AGM in April, and you can see our standard there, which is a relatively new standard. We got that in 2018. Slide, please. You can see there the laughter and friendship. Those two ladies have known each other for about 35 years, I believe. Don't quote me on that, but you can see the friendship there and what fun they were having. The next slide, please. This was the Cenotaph Parade, and if ever you're watching that, you will notice us in our tartan, because we're kind of eye-catching really with that many of us. And obviously you can see there at the front, the ladies in the wheelchairs, they have tartan blankets too. They're nice, cosy, fleecy ones. The lady on the far side is the lady who made those, Linda. She made those blankets so that they could make sure, because otherwise their tartan kilts are covered up, and we don't want that. So yes, next slide please. Again, more services. I realised earlier on that that's the same photo I showed earlier, I do apologise. Next slide. So the tartan, I promised you that I would talk a little bit more about that. So it was designed in 1989 by Arthur Mackay, I pronounce that, some may say Mackey, Scottish heritage, so I'm saying Mackay, of Strathmore Woolen Company, and it was at that point known as the Air Force tartan. The WAF Association in 1990 accepted this tartan as their own and what they would wear for their uniform. However, after much lobbying by the MOD, in particular the ex-commanding officer of RAF Lucas, it was accepted by the Air Force Board in 2002 and officially renamed as the Royal Air Force tartan. And we continue, as you can see, we continue to wear that as part of our uniform today. So there's a summary. Normally what you would do here, and I'm not sure I've actually said enough to warrant a summary, so I won't bore you with that. Next slide, please. And I found this picture on Facebook, and it says, we don't have girls in our British Armed Forces, we have warriors who happen to be female. Now what I'm going to do is pass you over to a lady who I count as a warrior because of all of the things that she has done. She may well have done less service time than me, but the things that she was involved in and has subsequently been involved in by far make her a warrior. So next slide please. So I'll give you JJ Adams.
Thank you very much. I'm quite honoured to be called a warrior because my predecessors before me were just quite outstanding themselves. So, my name is JJ Adams. Go next slide please. I'm very, very lucky in that you can see by the medals I'm wearing, they don't belong to me, they belong to my father and my grandfather. And my grandfather on the other side of my family was Navy, so I am actually technically third generation Royal Air Force. Considering the age of the Royal Air Force, you can't really get much further back than that. So I was very, very honoured that I am now third generation Royal Air Force, along with my uncle and my brother as well. Why I joined? Basically, I joined family business. I have been at a number of houses and a number of addresses and a number of units with my father. Very lucky to live all over the world, and very, very much like Tracy, had a great deal of strength and experience from the armed forces, and it really was a natural progression for me to join the RAF. It really was. So, my childhood, I lived in Norfolk. Because of the aircraft my father flew, and he flew every single Victor that has ever been in service, which initially was a nuclear bomber, and then it became a tanker, part of the V-Force, and one that you will really recognise from the V-Force was the Vulcan. And he was part of the team that organised the Vulcan getting down to the Falklands for the bombing of Port Stanley during the Falklands conflict. So he's flown every single Victor that was in service, and the unit for the Victors is in Norfolk, it's at RAF Marlow. And I went to boarding school just down the road at Swaffham. So that was a very good basis for service children, is to stay in one place of education, because otherwise I probably would have ended up at 7 different schools, which really is very detrimental to the children in the RAF. Whilst I was in boarding school, Daddy got posted to Germany, and he also got posted to Holland, so we were very lucky to live in the Netherlands. I also stayed at boarding school till my O-levels, but I didn't go on to school any further because Daddy was still in Holland and it was difficult to get me into sixth form college. So I then went on to be a nanny in Belgium, in Antwerp, and there I learnt French, which I was appalling at during the school times. Now I speak French with a Dutch accent, if you understand Belgium, and I apparently speak German with a Dutch accent, which I can't explain why. So I became a nanny and thoroughly enjoyed my time with a lovely, lovely family until the children came of age. And then it was deciding, what am I going to do next? Went back to the UK, and in 1983 decided that was the time to join the Royal Air Force, which I then decided to do. So, as you can see on the right-hand side, my brother, he was briefly in the RAF. My mother, whose father was in the RAF, my father, of course, and there's myself there. That photograph that you can see on your left was taken at Dernbach, and it's the most southern Commonwealth cemetery in Germany. And most of the gentlemen that are buried in there died during the forced marches during World War II. And they are predominantly Royal Air Force with a very, very big contingent of SAS as well. It's somewhere that I went to every single year for remembrance. So it's a very, very special place for me. And the first time I wore my daddy's medal was when I went to Dernbach the year after he died. So it was an incredibly moving place for me to go to. And on the right hand side is the obligatory photograph of you in your uniform. Next one, please. I then didn't know what I was going to do in the RAF because the trades had opened dramatically. Because after the Falklands War, there was an identity of the fact that we do need a much bigger cross-section of society within the armed forces. And there was a massive amount of recruitment done at that time, and women were introduced into that recruitment. So off I toddled to the Careers Information Office, which my father was very quiet about, didn't say anything, and I was offered the trade of WRF administration. I didn't have a clue what WRF administration was, but it wasn't a trade that was opened. You were actually selected for it. You were, if you like, headhunted. So I tootled back home and said, Daddy, I've been offered WAF administration. He hit the roof. He said, you can't do that. He said, that they're all thick and they all scream and shout in a praise square and they're all ugly, which I did think was a pretty valid argument. However, we found out more about it, and I spent a day with the WRF administration at RAF Cranwell and was very interested in what we did. To all intents and purposes, you are matron in the WAF block, and you look after the girls. You look after their security, you look after their welfare, you do the recruit training, you're responsible for all the drill and administration, and the biggie is you're responsible for their discipline. So you really are not the most popular person on the camp. Also, being WAF admin, you also put the fear of God into everybody else on camp, because the men didn't quite know what to do with these females, and particularly that one who's in charge of them. So you used to go around to various sections. I'd go around once a week, maybe to a different section where there were girls, to make sure that their welfare was maintained, that they had the right toilet facilities, that there was no bullying going on, that they were also being nurtured and looked after. So that was quite a powerful position to be in, but a very responsible one as well, because particularly when we brought YTS girls into the recruitment, we basically signed over as being their guardians. They were under 18, so we had to make sure that they were nurtured and cared for. And it was quite a responsibility, and it was quite helpful being frightening. Parts of the training was we had to be drill instructors. And being a drill instructor, you trained. You had to train your voice by standing against a wall, pushing your stomach out and shouting from your stomach. You also had to know about all the parades, you had to know about law, and a lot of the law comes from our normal civilian law, but you've got your military law as well, and all those regulations. You also had to know about the welfare, and you had to get it right. You also had to do a PTI course. Now, I will never ever claim to be a physical training instructor, but my 3 weeks at Cosford was very enlightening. One of the funniest modules was the trampolining. I've never laughed so hard in my life. But if we ever got stationed on a unit where there was no female WRAF PTI, then we took that role on as well. And that's also very key in being WAF admin. It's part of bringing a team together. It's part of getting people physically active. We've got to be fit, we've got to be motivated, and we've got to have some fun as well. And that's so important. So PTI was quite an important part of our trade. It's not, however, what the male counterparts in the RAF did. They were RAF admin, they certainly weren't PTIs. If anybody's watching, you weren't, you really weren't. The other thing we were involved in was imprisonment of WRAF. There were no prisons for women who committed crimes. Most of the time, if they were committing a crime and they were guilty, they would be discharged. Whereas men would go to Colchester at the Military Corrective Training Centre. And there at least they did their time, and a lot of the time come back again. The girls didn't. They were out. They were finished. And that was actually quite unjust, but there was nothing we could do at the time. That was the regulations. We also organised the courts martial. And those were very interesting, but that was only for the women's side of things. But it was quite an interesting time. Things were coming in. Things were definitely changing when I joined up. We also, then our trade amalgamated with the guys. April 1984, we then became RAF admin, WRF admin was disbanded. It was a massive change in the RAF and it was a very, very big spin. Before, women did not have to be combatant. You could opt out of carrying a weapon. When it came to 1984, you had to be combatant, and it did actually upset quite a few girls. They didn't want to be forced into the situation of being armed. Personally, I find it a little bit odd that you will be in a military armed force to protect your citizens that you were paid by, not to be a combatant, but I could understand that argument too. There were lots of things that changed. So if you wanted to stay in the RAF, you wanted to be signed on to extend your service, you had to be combatant. And that became quite interesting.
I thought women couldn't fight until very recently, like about 2018 was it?
That could have been another force, but in the RAF, it was 1984. Yeah, I'll never forget it. And our trade also got disbanded. So what do? We joined the guys. They operated out of the guard room, and that was court martials. We had to go back to Swinderby. We had to do an assimilation course where I learned arms drill, I learned sword drill, I learned stick drill, pace stick drill, things that we never did in the WRAF. We never carried, but I was not going to be training women. I was going to be instructing men. And boy, did that make things change. Some of the guys that were in the trade of RAF admin very seriously objected to women amalgamating into the trade, and they did leave early out of complete objection to what we were doing, that we were coming to game, and we were going to be working from the guard room before we operated from the WAF block, which was the WRF accommodation. So all these interlopers were going to come into the men's world, and granted on the station it was, what are we going to do now? These women are going to be in charge of us. The biggest thing was, in the trade of RAF admin, you became a Station 1 officer. That was the highest pinnacle of your rank, was to be a Station 1 officer, which in the Army the equivalent is the Regimental Sergeant Major. You're God. Even the CO listens to you. You are God. And we're going to have women as Station 1 officers carrying the stick, the pace stick. Some women in our trade were a little bit shaky about it, but it really changed the balance within a camp. There was a WAF in a skirt who's going to teach you arms drill. She's going to be the one with the stick. She's going to tell you to get your hair cut. She's going to tell you to get your hands out of your pockets. She's going to be running all the court martials. And we also were involved with prisoner handling. So it really brought women into the men's world in a massive, massive way, and a very, very public way on camp. You couldn't miss us at all. It did cause ructions. I'm not listening to you, as I think you will be. It was very, very interesting, but it was very challenging for our trade because we had to come up to the step. If I'm going to be disciplining anyone, or if I'm going to be doing drill, or if I'm going to do an instruction, I have to be exemplary. I have to be the best. I can't tell someone about their appearance if mine isn't the best. So we really had to come up to the mark, and the failure rate for our training was 80%. So we really had to be good, and it was tough. But it was very, very interesting. When I first did my first drill of a team of guys, a flight of gentlemen, it was a big unit, and all the drill instructors have got their various bits that I'll pick up on. Sometimes it's not holding their head properly, sometimes it's flapping their arms around. For me it was fingers, you've got to keep your fingers close together. And these poor guys had been drilled to death for about 3 hours, and it was my turn, and you could see them, and it was the old SLR, which was the long rifle, and it was standing there, and you thought, oh. I said, well gentlemen, I bet you've never been drilled by a WAF before. And you could see them trying to compute this in their heads. Oh no, we haven't. Oh no, we haven't. And I always wore a skirt because the visual of you wearing a skirt, they can see that a woman is teaching them drill. They don't want you to be better. They don't want you to shame them, and they don't want you to pull them up. And I said, and I bet, gentlemen, you've never been drilled by with a WAF wearing stockings and suspenders. And they fell about laughing because they relaxed. The worst thing to do drill is to be all tense and all worried. It just goes all wrong. And I said, right, gentlemen, I shall be showing you how to handle your personal weapons, and if you don't do it properly, I'll just have to show you for you. And we had a great time. They really did pull it out the bag. And the nicest thing was a couple of years down the line, they all turned up for parade, you got the list down, and I was just round the back of the guard room as they all turned up, and I overheard one of the lads say, oh great, we got JJ again. And I thought, yeah, that worked. It was good. It was really important. So it was an interesting time. Things changed very quickly and very, very rapidly. Okay, next slide please. So, as you can see, we were involved in parades. Yes, poor chap, he put his weapon round his hat and he lost his hat, so very quickly and discreetly you get your kit back to him. The middle picture, right, yes, that was a good one. Battle of Britain Parade, Melton Mowbray, and my flight of lads were marching up the road and they were talking. And you can just tell I was not having it. They did know about it afterwards, and they were reminded that there were young men of 18, 19 years of age that got into aircraft that barely of them had 5 minutes flying in and risked their lives, of which we were commemorating. And talking in parade is not acceptable. And I think you gathered that. Unfortunately, doing sports, which I loved, absolutely loved. I was very lucky to be selected by the RAF Athletics squad to hurdle, and I went to America, to Colorado, to the academy there, and got to do high altitude training there, so it was a real honour, but I had to work for it. Next slide please. So, after that change happened, which was massive, things started to settle down in the RAF. There was an acceptance of women into the trades. We had far more technician females. On one unit I was at, for example, the Tornado Squadron, 10 Squadron, they would borrow a WAF every now and then from another team because their hands were tiny and she didn't get in a nose cone to get to the radar system. So there were very great skills in having women. They are sometimes far more analytical, they are far more organised. There's all sorts of skills that women brought into the Air Force that all of a sudden these guys were realising we've got a real benefit of having a girl on our team, and it worked very, very well. They also up their game a bit more. They're a little bit smarter, they're a little bit tidier. The language calms down, the respect goes up, and it works both ways too. So there are very, very great strengths in having women on your team, as well as having guys on your team, because we had a lot of heavyweight WAF trades, where to have a guy in that trade helped a great deal as well. So I arrived in got posted to Berlin, and I had a beautiful little Triumph Spitfire. It was January, and I broke down before I even left the UK. I eventually got over to mainland Europe, and the snow was ridiculous, and I'm in a Triumph Spitfire. I got myself to the East-West German border at a place called Helmstadt. And you go in for a briefing, and the Royal Military Police show you this wonderful video of which junctions you'll take, which ones you won't. You get this folder, and don't do this. Don't speak to anybody in a grey uniform because they're East Germans. But you can speak to someone who's in a brown uniform because they're Russians. We're friends with Russians. We're in the middle of a Cold War and we're friends with Russians. Right, okay, I'll try and compute that one. So, watched this video, and this lovely RAF military police, Royal Military Policeman Army said, but don't worry about breaking down because it probably wouldn't happen. I'd already broken down. So I thought, right, okay, off we go. So I travelled down the corridor of Berlin, which is between Berlin and Helmstadt. It's exactly 200 kilometres. You can only do it in 2 hours. If you go any faster, you get done for speeding. No, sorry, if you go any faster, you get done for spying. And if you go any sorry, I'm going to
the
get
other
shot.
way.
That's right, darling, you were there, weren't you? If you go any faster, you get done for speeding. If you go any slower, you get done for spying. So you really made sure you hit your markers. I managed to get down the corridor and I'm at Russian checkpoint Bravo. I'm finally in Berlin. And I've got my documents and I go to the Russian officer and I salute him even though I'm in civilians. And we have a little word and he checks my documents. They go into I go into a little porter cabin, shut them through this letterbox. They disappear and I'm standing there and there's cameras and there's mirror glass. And I'm in Berlin, I finally got here. Shook the paper, came out with my ID, went okay to the Russian officer, saluted to him, got in my little Spitfire, click. Oh, no. I did everything you're supposed to do. I rocked it in second gear, I checked the distributor. I knew it was none of those. I knew I burned the starter motor out. So I'm standing there, it's middle of the night, it's minus 20, it's January, my boots are starting to freeze on my feet, and I've got a broken down classic car. So I filled out my breakdown report and waited. And eventually that disappeared, and out came a Soviet officer, immaculate. And he said, could you please ask your friends to help you? And I couldn't because my breakdown report had gone. I wasn't allowed to move because they knew where I was, and if I then disappeared, they've got people looking for me. And I said, I'm afraid I can't really go. And he said, well, I want you to ask your friends. And I said, okay. And I went to these guys and I said, listen guys, you can't help me. I've got to stay. And I said, please tell Checkpoint Bravo I'm okay. The Allied checkpoint. No problem. 4 hours later, an American breakdown truck came and picked me up and put me and my lovely little Spitfire on the back of it when I arrived at RAF Gatow. And ever since then, they never forgot me. My little white Spitfire was known throughout Berlin. And I did actually lend it to a friend of mine. And somebody said to me, JJ, did you go brunette the other day? And I said, no, that was my friend that borrowed my car, so that was fine. Berlin was astonishing. It was at the time of the Berlin Wall. It was height of Cold War. And we knew then that we had nuclear warheads pointing at us at RAF Gatow. It was one of the units that was used during the airlift, so it was very historical importance. And there was even a building on camp, there was called Copper House. And it was a house that was clad in copper, and it was Goering's private residence. And the reason it was clad in copper was apparently he suffered from arthritis. I don't know if it had any relevance at all, but the Station 1 officer lived there, and this amazing man called Brian Grimwood, astonishing. It was the contrast of East and West. On the other side of our camp wall was the biggest tank range in Europe, and it was East Germany. We knew that these guys, they had, while I was there, they changed the wall into a fence because it's easier to push a fence down on the wall if anything goes wrong. We knew that if anyone got hit and there was a war, Gütersloh had 15 minutes survival rate, and they were about 3 hours down the road. We had nothing. We were in the epicenter if anything happened. It was a tense time, but we were also diplomats to the fact that we were Royal Air Force, that we were British, so you were very aware as you travelled around Berlin that you were technically an occupying force, that you were British military, and when you went over to East Berlin, you had to wear your full best uniform. So you were very, very aware of your representation. It was quite a sad time to go over the East. It was fascinating, but there were so many elements of the kick-off of propaganda. Sometimes I got spat on because I was a woman in uniform. You didn't see many American women in uniform, even though the American forces were there. You barely saw any of the French, and of course there was us guys. We also had lots of responsibility within Berlin in the fact that we had to look after the West Berliners in case there was a blockade again. We had to be very aware that we had to keep those corridors open, which were the 3 air corridors and also the Norman Road corridor. So you knew that if there was just a tiny flick in anything political, it could be catastrophic, not just for us, but the whole of the West Berlin occupying people there. It was very, very tense. But it was very, very interesting as well, and it was an absolute honour to be there. The one thing that was interesting socially was us guys, Brick Mill, and particularly us girls, and I have a very dear friend here, and we were both there together in Berlin at the same time. We really, truly were a family. And regardless of conflicts within trades, whether you like that person or not, no matter what, we stuck together. We looked after each other. And I'm very proud to say that even today, and I left there in 1991, we are still very, very close. And we still look after each other. And we were still valuing each other. We had quite a large WAF unit there. They all looked after each other, and we are very much in touch now. So those strengths were so, so valuable, and they were nurtured there. And one of the people that nurtured it greatly was our Station 1 officer, who sadly is no longer with us, but I'm in touch with his son, which is super. At that time, while we were there, Rudolf Hess died in Spandau prison. The first thing that flagged up was, who's in charge of the prison? Because it was rotated between the Russians, the French, the Americans and the Brits. The Americans and the French and the Brits had already decided that since it was within the Brit sector that we would get it. We'd get Spandau prison. If the Russians were in charge, we got a problem because Spandau prison was right on the perimeter of one of our barracks, our army barracks. So they can just look over the wall and they are right onto us. So there was a lot of tension. So the first question was who's in charge? And it was the Americans. So we were okay. There had already been plans with Spandau prison what would happen when Hess died, and it was going to become a British military shopping centre. Honestly, and a cinema, and there was a bit, what are we going to call it? And it actually became Britannia Centre, but yes, it was going to be called, we all called it Hesco's. Shocking, I know. Rudolf Hess died on the Thursday, and he technically passed away in the British Military Hospital because it was the nearest one to Spandau. By that weekend, every stick of furniture was outside was removed. By that night, by the weekend, the roof had gone, and 2 weeks later, there was no Spandau prison. It was gone. It was, again, political. Every single brick, except for a few that got squirreled away, and I didn't have one of them, every brick was crushed because there was a fear that neo-Nazis would take hold of those bricks and build a memorial to Hess. So we had to literally get rid of everything, so there'd be completely nothing whatsoever that was anything associated with Nazis or Rudolf Hess. If you want to know where Spandau prison is, it's the foundations for the 600-metre range at Army Battalion, which we needed to renovate, but that's where that ended up. During that time as well, we were under increasing threat of the IRA. It was quite a tragic time because in a very, very short space of time, we lost a number of RAF personnel to shootings in Germany. And that really raised our risk system. We had to be very careful of when we were out in public. We adopted a phrase called Shark Watch, where we would look out within our community. So if we're in a group going outside, we're going to the bar or a restaurant, with one person sober was Shark Watch. And that, in a way, started my groundings in my future career for when I left the RAF, which was quite interesting, is observing, watching, taking care. It was quite tragic because we also had a young RAF child that was killed in a shooting, a baby, if you remember, which was, it was absolutely horrendous. He was shot in his vehicle outside a petrol station. And of course, all of those things affected the local community as well, because they were our community, the Germans as well. It was really very, very emotional and very upsetting, and again, very political. So it was quite a tense time. So not only do we have terrorism fighting us, we've also got the East German and the Russian situation going on. So that was a really, really interesting time. Royal visits. While I was in Berlin, it was the 650th anniversary of the Royal Air Force. The Queen came. 650. Yeah, 650 years of Berlin. The Queen came, everybody came. Diana and Charles came, the Duchess of York came, everybody. It was almost as if I got this feeling they were all sitting around the table at Sandringham for afternoon tea saying, "Do you know what, that's a lovely place to go to. they don't half do it nicely, and you have a cracking parade as well. I did 4 Queen's birthday parades at RAF in Berlin, which were fabulous at the Olympic Stadium. Great showpieces, great fun, a lot of dented Land Rovers, some very smelly chieftain tanks, but it was marvellous. And again, it was a great way to show the German public and to show also the Americans and the French, the Russians, how powerful we were. They did their thing on the 1st of May over the East. So it was kind of a tit for tat. And we also used to have Juli, 17th of June parade, all the way through the middle of Berlin. And that was really something special as well. All very political. We're all pawns. Next slide, please. So, I was very lucky that I was selected to be on a special reaction force. I was the only woman in Germany at that time that was on a special reaction force. So you're very lucky that's not a scratch and sniff. We used to go out in the field with the guys. It was an interesting situation when I went out because I knew the guys and I also knew a lot of their wives. And JJ's going to be living in a hole in the ground with my husband, and I used to say, trust me darling, if you did, you wouldn't have married him. But it was also a good grounding for my future career, which I wasn't aware of at the time. But it was, again, very, very serious, very serious. And as you can see, quite happy on the right there that the wall had come down. Quite an emotional time. The royal visits, one of them being, as you can see there, Princess Diana with Charles, and on the far side, you can't quite see her through the other side, was Fergie. Sorry, one of the things I just want to go back to with the wall coming down, what was an absolute honour was I was very lucky to be, I think, the first British military person under the Brandenburg Gate when the wall came down, because we had to wear our uniform to go to the east, and of course we kind of stuck out. And this very, very dear old lady came up to me, and it was full of crowds, thousands of people and film crews and all sorts, and this very sweet lady, she must have been in her 80s, and she came up to me and she gave me the biggest hug and kiss, and she gave me a tiny straw angel because it was Christmas time. And that is one of the most precious things that I own, is this little straw angel. Never forgotten it. But with royal visits, everybody came, as I said. So again, organisation, planning, the IRA, all that preparation that we would have to do to make sure that our royal visits were secure. Lots and lots of collaboration with all the forces out there, as well as civilian organisations. We used to get a lot of people going down drain holes and sticking lead over things. Very interesting. Next one, please. Then I got brought back to the UK. Had to happen. I spent 4 great years in Berlin. And I noticed the contrasts coming back to the UK. Culturally, things had changed within the UK with regards to the RAF. People predominantly living off base. You couldn't do that in Germany. You weren't allowed to. So we were this big family within the camp. So people living off base, they had their own lives. They had their own civilian neighbours. They had their own civilian lifestyle. So it was very much a big line between being at work in the office during the day and then you went home. The other thing was they wanted to get more involved with, well, we all wanted to get involved with more civilian organisations. Very healthy for the military to do that. But it was a big, big change. And then the biggest was the accommodation. We used to be in 4-man rooms, or 12-man rooms, or 8-man rooms, which is really interesting. And I think that's the Queen's interesting, because when she ever says she's interested, finds something interesting, it means it's not that great. But what it also did was it isolated people. They'd go into their room and they'd lock the door. If you're going into a house with somebody, there's always somebody around. But you can go in your room and you can lock that door and you won't see them again until maybe the next week, because they're off for the weekend. And that really was a big change. It was a big thing for us welfare-wise. You really had to look out for people. We did have a few instances with girls where they were struggling with being in a male environment. There were some issues of intimidation. There were some issues of just coping with being a woman in the world and being in a male environment in the world, and that girl situation of looking after each other. wasn't there. It was just easy to close that door. I'm sorry, I haven't done anything wrong. That's not funny for change. So that was when I stepped in a lot harder of looking after the girls, because there were those instances. So it was, the observation had to be a lot harder. But it just was a change in culture, and that was very interesting, but it seemed to happen very quickly. Next slide, please. Where I was posted, oh boy, we spend a lot of time in Lincolnshire. Lots of flat land, lots of airfields, makes it cheap to build an airfield, but a lot of time in Lincolnshire. My first posting was at Cosford in West Midlands, which is a very busy unit, and it was a training unit as well. RAF St Athan near Cardiff, another enormous unit. It was basically the service station of the Royal Air Force. It was where if your aircraft needed its big service, it went off to Cosford, to St Athan. Sometimes they'd repaint it, sometimes they'd strip it down, sometimes they'd say, do you know what? It's had its day, it's off to the breakers yard. So you'd see a lot of dead lightnings and a few dead Vulcans. It was quite sad, but that was at St Athan. RAF Cottesmore, Rutland Water, interestingly enough, one of the highest units in the RAF. We used to get a lot of fog and a lot of snow. A lot of people didn't realise, you would think that. And funny enough, that was where my daddy was stationed when I was born. So it was like coming home. It was really interesting. That was, as well, the Top Gun unit of the RAF. Tornadoes, we had Italians, we had Germans, and we had Brits. We used to say you knew which was the Brit Tornado because they were parked very smartly. You knew the Italian Tornado because it was turned in reverse, and you knew the German Tornado because it had a towel over the canopy. But they were great. We really had a great time. And this was when it got interesting, because RAF Cottesmore, when I was there, was the first time we had our female fast jet pilot, Jo Salter. And that really started to prick her ears up, because when I joined up, you couldn't be aircrew. And she was fast jet, and she was very good. In fact, apparently she terrified the living heck out of all the instructors, and it was only the German chief instructor, the teacher, but she was excellent. Then I went off to Colchester, the glass house. I wasn't a prisoner, I was trained staff. That is, in my opinion, the most effective penal system that we could employ in this country. When you turn up there, the re-offend rate is 2.5% when I went there, which is astonishing, when at that time the re-offend rate in the civilian system was 80%. It was an incredible place. Their reward is there, punishment is there, but very fairly. It's a fantastic system. But at that time, we had females going into Colchester, female prisoners. So that meant it was more equitable. Girls weren't being kicked out because they'd done something wrong, that guys could do their time and then go back. So that was a really fair system that brought girls back into that brought girls up to the same level as guys. Really good system. So I did Colchester. They have a pig farm there. They breed pigs and they look after pigs. They've got a garden centre. So it's a really fantastic place. And people who are coming discharged out of the military because they've done something wrong, they are also retrained for civilian life. So Colchester was an extremely interesting experience. And the reason I went to Colchester was I then found out that I was going to the Falkland Islands, which I'd managed to get away with. Everybody been to the Falkland Islands, probably except for me. In Berlin I couldn't go because I had to stay in Berlin, and at Cottesmore we couldn't go because it was a tri-national unit. So I found out I was going to the Falkland Islands, and when I said where I was going to, everyone was saying, "Are you sure?" I said, "What do you mean?" 38 facility, the Bronx. I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Oh, okay." I was running the prison, and I was the first woman to run the prison in Falkland Islands, which was, again, fascinating, but really enjoyed it. Sorry, next slide, please. So in the Falkland Islands, allegedly now, there are no minefields, but we used to drive through them. Fairly, they were all clear, but we went, and that was when we were rescued from one of the units because we got snowed in and we couldn't get out, so everybody got a Chinook to come get us, which was very kind of them. But it was the only way actually really could get around the Falkland Islands. They did have aircraft, but That was about the only way we could get around properly. But the Falklands was fascinating, and recently we've just had the memorial for the HMS was Sheffield, wasn't it? And I've been to the memorial, and it's extremely moving. It's in the middle of a rockhopper penguin colony, and it's so you've got these gorgeous little rock hoppers, and you just look out over this expanse of sea, and it just pulls at you. It's so sad, but that's the business we're in. Next slide, please. So, civilian life, what on earth am I going to do? I was a drill instructor. I boss people around. What am I going to do? Not quite sure what to do until I saw an advertisement that security was needed in London, and I took the job on and quite quickly became a close protection operative, which in layman's terms is a bodyguard. And I was very fortunate that I started quite high up, whereas the Sultan of Brunei was my first client. So I kind of, I didn't really dip my toes in carefully, I jumped in right up to my neck. And I absolutely loved it. The transferable skills were phenomenal. I'd already done in the field, I'd already done discipline, I'd already done royals. So there was the skills already. You had to be exemplary in what you did, you had to represent your client, you had to be good. So doing close protection was excellent. So that was what I then merged into. And then I thought, I'm going to advertise, I'm going to answer this thing in the paper. And it was, there's a new game show. I thought, ooh, be Bulgarian, I want a fridge freezer. And they said, no, it's, we got this new thing. Basically what we're going to do is we're going to lock you in a prison and you're going to have to break out. And I started laughing, and the researcher said, why? I said, well, actually, I ran a prison, and you could hear the cogs going, we're having it. And I ended up on a reality TV show on Channel 5, which was quite new then, called Jailbreak, where teams of us had to get out of the prison, and there were 5 guys and 5 girls. And I looked at the girls. One was a grandmother, one was a student, one was a nutty housewife, and the other was a glamour model. And I thought, I'm doomed. I'm just going to end up staying in here. In the other room, there was an ex-Royal Engineer, there was an ex-Para, there was an ex-Royal Artillery, there was a garage car salesman, and an architect. I thought, I ain't going to open out. How am I going to get out with these and this lot? Ladies and gentlemen, we got out first, and we
Yay!
Yay!
So I was very pleased about
Go
that.
girls.
Very pleased about that, but they were fantastic. What a great bunch of girls. Then pretty much around that time, Survivor came up. Now I didn't know about Survivor, but apparently at the time it was massive in America. I applied for that, and 50,000 people applied for it, and thought, I'm not going to get that. And I did. But unfortunately, with the politics of Survivor, I didn't do any research, and I should have. They like to get rid of the strong people first, and I was number 2, which is fair enough. But again, pulling people together, getting people organised, it was quite interesting, and I did lose my temper a few times. That's well recorded. Then I thought, I'll have a bash at this at presenters, and it was a bit like the X Factor, being a television presenter, and I got in the final of that. I knew I wouldn't win it, but that was very interesting. Again, when you're doing presentations, you're doing training, you're doing instruction, that's kind of what you're doing. So I was quite pleased to do well into the end of that. And then the last thing I've done in reality TV was they wanted female instructor to be on Bad Lads Army. And I don't know if you've heard of Bad Lads Army, but basically you get a bunch of reprobates and they go through 1950s recruit training, which is the language, the food, the uniform, the attitude. And it was very interesting. These lads were criminals, they were lots of children, they were disruptive, they were problems, they had social problems, and we had to get them together to go through this training. And I was on the 3rd series, which was the only series where they had female instructors, and that was interesting. But they did very well. The one thing they could not do in my presence was swear. And when every other word is a swear word, that was tricky. So you're going to do 20 press-ups and they're going to do 40. Shut up, don't say anything, JJ's in here, Corporal's in here. But it really worked well, and I'm so proud of them. One of the guys joined the army, he's done 2 tours of Afghanistan. Another guy is now a champion gym maker. Another guy became a parachute instructor. They have all achieved beyond what I ever expected. So I'm quite proud that my guys did so well. Very, very proud. So yeah, quite interesting to do TV. Very interesting. Next, please. Then I got sent out to Afghanistan where I did close protection. And this was quite difficult because I was in a camp on a contract where there were 650 men and me and one other instructor that was a lady. And there I worked, I was looking after and basically bodyguarding Australian Federal Police, 1-star general and his colonels. And the job out there was to protect these guys so that they could help the security forces, the Afghan security forces in Kabul. I'm not going to go too much into detail of it because I can't, but it was quite a shock in that somebody called JJ is coming out, and JJ was me, not a bloke. And that put a lot of stress on some of the system, in that there's the perception of a guy, and it's not, it's a woman. But the other thing that came out of it was, you then use your female skills, and I wouldn't say attributes because that's wrong, but you are also, like it was before, you're bringing up the guys, hopefully. Their language changed, their appearance changed. There was a certain element of professional jealousy. What the hell is she doing here? Why have we got this female here? And fortunately, my previous experience with bodyguarding sold me, which was really, really helpful. One of my operations manager, he had a problem with one of the clients, didn't want me to take them down on a job, and he said, that girl is the best one on camp, regardless of who all the guys are. And it is a difficult perception to overcome. You're also dealing in a very, very masculine culture, and you're a woman. But with the culture out there, I found that if you've got the bigger gun, they're going to listen to you. It doesn't matter who's holding it. So that also helped as well. This lovely gentleman over here, it's quite sad. This location where I'm pictured here, the reason I got short hair was I had a massive brain aneurysm, had lots of emergency brain surgery in Afghanistan, and then I went back again. So yeah, it was quite a tricky time. My hair grew, thank God. But this gentleman here, where this is located is a place called Turquoise Mountain, and it's one of the places that Prince Charles champions. And there they do City and Guilds training, where they're training girls as well as guys, very, very traditional aspects of Afghan culture. And this chap here, he is making these, I'm going to point my horrible finger across, he's making these shutters because they don't have windows. So they have shutters to keep the light out. He was almost drummed out by the Russians and also the Taliban, but he stayed and he taught the next generation of these crafts, and he was absolutely exquisite, very, very good. And that was my office. Okay, next one please. And then the lovely thing, this is Eid outside our compound. These children here are members of the Kutchi tribe that live behind our compound, and it's quite sad, they're animals, they're sheep, only eat rubbish. So God knows what these poor children were eating. But when it comes to Eid, they get nice new clothes and they get toys. One year it was plastic AK-47s, which left us very, very twitchy because we didn't know what was real and what wasn't. This little boy here, he never ever would come near to me. He was terrified of me. It was like looking at a scarpering puppy, absolutely terrified. But to get him laughing on that day after giving him sweets was just the best feeling on earth. It really was. And these children were wonderful. They were the future, and you did everything you could so that they would go home and say, those lovely people, they're so nice and they help us. And that's what we've got to look for, is the future. Next one, please. Yeah, there we go. Funny old thing, eh? That was Jailbreak, and on the far side there was Survivor. My teeth were a lot whiter there. It's a good picture, I'm quite trying to say. Sorry. Next one, please. And this was Bad Lads Army, and I'm just over there. And those are my bad lads before their world caved in. Next one, please. And no, I am certainly not Superwoman, but thank you very much, Tracy. But as a Women's Royal Air Force veteran, we're pretty close. Thank you so much. Thank you. Yes,
questions.
yeah, probably not.
Were there any questions online?
No, not
No, that's probably because they all know
Yeah,
us.
exactly. Everybody
They
knows.
probably all know us. And do either of you, anybody have questions here? We've clearly covered it all, so thank
Probably.
you ever so much for your time.
Yes,
Something
absolutely.
will come, I'm sure, because
Well,
it's so much.
I'm sorry, there's a lot more actually, which you've
I
been
told
sleeping
her
back.
to
You told me
keep
to
it
keep
brief.
It's hard.
Fascinating.
Those that know me and JJ know that we can both go off piste. So we've done quite well to keep it into an hour.
Now, when's the pub open?
But
See?
that's
Yeah.
So thank you ever so much.
Thank
and,
you so much.
And
Thank
goodbye
you.
to all of you online.
Yes, bye everybody.